Northwest Now is supported, in part, by viewers like you. Thank you.
Puget Sound is the liquid heart of western Washington, a massive estuary where for the 15,000 years following the last ice age, the abundance of life was almost indescribable. But 169 years ago, the first white settlers arrived, and within just a few decades built an infrastructure focused solely on turning a profit.
And you really see this in Tacoma, where the railroad came first, where the railroads absolutely ringed the shoreline. They ran right along the shoreline, completely around the city, out around Point Defiance, the entire area.
Land grants incentivized the railroads to build aggressively and claim vast swaths of property. But the real prizes were the so-called gravity routes along the level shores of the Sound.
So the railroads tended to want to be right on the shoreline for operational reasons, but they also appreciated that by going there they'd get the property, which meant that they could control the industries that happened between the railroad line and the water. So suddenly they owned the shore, they owned all the waterfront, and then they could control the shipbuilders or the sawmills or the, whatever industry might be there between their railroad line and the water.
The railroads were certainly innovators, introducing a revolutionary coal ash and petroleum product injected into wood timbers and pilings at high pressure, making it last for generations.
The railroad brought with them the technology of creosote. I mean, they were using creosote as a wood preservative for ties and for the primary structures that they were building, bridges, trestles, that kind of thing. And so this is where the technology of preserved wood wanders from the railroad tracks into the shoreline. The early use starts to show up in the Northwest, really late 1880s, 1890s, kind of in that period. And then by 1900, it's pretty ubiquitous. It's just about everywhere.
Creosote in the Puget Sound is a legacy of industry. It's a big deal because when our economy kind of started up, our natural resource-based economy, we had an abundance of timber, and we had a need to build a maritime industry out over the water. And so we needed a way to preserve that wood in the aquatic environment. And once the creosote treating process was discovered, it was implemented at just a very large scale across the whole state, including up into Canada.
Eventually, the railroads lost their monopoly over the waterfront, which sparked yet another round of creosote-preserved overwater development during a sort of golden age of canneries, mills, and waterborne transportation on Puget Sound. As the dominance of the railroads faded and commerce moved inland, most of Puget Sound's historic overwater businesses slowly disappeared. But the toxic legacy of creosote remains, a witch's brew of 300 chemicals, now slowly dissolving out of all the old wood.
Well, the problem with pilings, right, creosote pilings, is that they continually leach chemicals that are detrimental to aquatic organisms in the Puget Sound and in other areas, right? You've got a continual slow leach of chemicals like PCBs, and we know those cause damage to both salmon and orcas.
Puget Sound is home to a unique race of orca and 8 species of salmon, trout, and char that populate 37 unique runs, most of which are now either extinct, on the endangered species list, or threatened. The orca's decline is well documented too, but something is also wrong with the abundance of the small crustaceans and baitfish that form the base of the Sound's food web, and the toxic remnants of creosote are showing up in the tissues of many species tested at places like WSU's Research Center in Puyallup.
The thing is we know because when we take samples from orca whales, for example, we find these chemicals in their fat, and they do cause a lot of sublethal effects, damage to the organism. Maybe not outright mortality, but they can reduce reproduction and cause other negative effects. Salmon are a little different because they don't spend all of their time in one area. All right, so they move from freshwater systems into estuaries, out into the ocean, then come back. They don't accumulate the same levels of some of these contaminants that orcas would, but they do pick them up, and therefore we're being exposed to them when we eat the fish, and the other organisms like orcas that eat them are accumulating them, and they accumulate up the food chain.
On the eastern shore of Bainbridge Island is the Wyckoff Eagle Harbor Superfund site. One of the area's largest creosote plants operated here for 85 years, spreading PAH, PCB, oils, and dioxin into the soil, groundwater, and across 100 acres of sediment at the bottom of Eagle Harbor. The cleanup on Bainbridge started in 1991, and it won't be finished until at least 2032. But the on-site contamination is the easy part. The real challenge is regathering the creosote-infused wood drifting on the tides all across the Salish Sea. Washington State's creosote removal program started in 2004, and so far, with the help of about 50 partnerships, has pulled about 28,000 tons of contaminated wood out of the water, only about half the estimate of what's still out there. About 800,000 pounds of that total has been collected by hand in the San Juans through a partnership with the Samish tribe, a people legend says descends from J-pod orca.
Creosote is, a very good wood preservative, and that's why it was used so profusely, but it's also made up of a petrochemical soup. Many of its components are known carcinogens and are also toxic to beach biota, and leaching out into the environment is part of the toxic chain that runs all the way up to orcas and salmon and all the other things out here in the Salish Sea. So it's a pretty nasty toxin, and so removing it from the environment and making it so it's not available is a good thing for the health of the Salish Sea.
It's another persistent chemical in the Puget Sound. The way that it interacts with the food web mostly is through the impacts it has on our forage fish that are spawning in the near shore and in the back shore near this creosote or along existing standing pilings. The herring spawn will die off when exposed to creosote, and then also you have the bioaccumulation within those species. And forage fish are a primary food source for our out-migrating salmon. And so right there you're introducing creosote and PAH into that food web, making it all the way up to our large marine mammals, into our orcas. And that's why you see so much bioaccumulation for them, especially when they're starting to not have enough food. They burn those fat stores where all those chemicals are stored. And that's when we start having problems, or continue to have the problems we're having.
Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Over the years, hand crews are slowly attacking about 1,000 miles of shoreline, hoping to remove about 500,000 pounds of creosote-soaked wood every year. This effort on Lopez Island is unbelievably difficult, getting to remote beaches, wrestling huge pieces of wood into manageable sizes, and then hauling it all off for disposal. With limited funding, the effort relies on the enthusiasm of volunteers, and after years of work, there is progress.
a lot of the beaches that we've cleaned that had never been cleaned before, we are not seeing repopulation. So we know that once we've got them cleaned, in a lot of cases, we're not seeing stuff come back, or far less come back in future years. So I think for us, the win is when we leave a beach that day and it's clean. That's a big win just for the day. But also we know we're making an impact over the long haul by having this stuff removed. The core members are the real unsung heroes. You know, I'm sure you'll see them lifting this stuff. You know, all this stuff is lifted off the beach onto a boat, and then off the boat onto a beach, and then often a third time off the last beach into a trailer. And so, you know, that 800,000 pounds has been all lifted by these young folks with a lot of passion and energy, 3 times at least. So they're the real heroes of this project.
There's a great sense of purpose coming out here to like physically remove the pollution from the environment. I just come out here to get a first-hand experience with kind of the heart of why we do environmental engineering.
I just love the great outdoors and figuring out what I can do to keep it beautiful and connect with nature and just be able to work outside with my hands. And this was a really cool project in a unique location, and so I jumped on the opportunity. I never even realized it was here, and so just that discovery is just, there's a whole new thing that I'm able to do and make a whole difference.
I am out here because I want to make a difference in this beautiful green space. They've given so much to me, and so I just want to try and give back what I can to these awesome spaces outdoors. I think it instills a great deal of responsibility and just a deep caring for the outdoors, and looking back, I know I'm gonna really appreciate all the time, the hard work, the sweat, and everything has all been worth it.
And these are all from beaches that are generally not accessible by road. So that's why we're using the landing crafts behind me to land on the beaches and haul this stuff away. So mostly we're focused on diffuse creosote, which is a toxin in the environment. But when we leave a beach, there's no styrofoam. We get, you know, plastic bottles, you know, we run trash cleanups as well. So it's a mix of things that we're pulling off the beaches. There's still a lot out here. We survey every spring, and oftentimes beaches that we've already cleaned get repopulated with new pilings that have been floating around. So it's, we're not working ourselves out of a job yet, but we hope to sometime soon.
The drifting creosote-contaminated logs are moving targets, but Puget Sound is dotted with tens of thousands of fixed pilings, too. At a minimum, the pilings contain a gallon of creosote per foot.
We did a Puget Sound-wide survey of creosote, just standing pilings, in 2009. And as it stands, we're about halfway through those. And so we've got about 15 to 16,000 more pilings that are actually standing, or were standing in 2009, that remain. And we've taken a lot of the low-hanging fruit, the stuff that's on public land, and so a lot of the other sites have a little bit more difficult ownership and trying to get people on board with getting that stuff out of the water or replacing it.
So many creosote pilings remain because they're grandfathered in, which is why, to go beyond the 2.3 million acres of aquatic lands it manages, the Department of Natural Resources needs more cooperation from private landowners to get the creosote out. Another problem is funding. Even before the coronavirus struck, the state was cutting the Puget Sound recovery budget to make room for education and other needs. And the Obama and Trump administrations handed cuts to the EPA and NOAA, adding insult to injury from simultaneously declining shellfish lease revenues and the shrinking oil and gas taxes that fund the cleanup. So it's in that trying environment that the state is spending about $1 million to remove more than 1,000 old pilings from the Dickman Mill site on the Tacoma waterfront. The Dickman Mill was the last of the dozens of old-style overwater sawmills on Tacoma's shoreline. It finally closed in 1977, but then burned violently in 1979. And that could be a big problem since the pilings burned down to the low-tide waterline, possibly weakening them.
Because it's a sort of oily-based material, in a fire will catch fire, and it will sustain a fire like a tire off your car. The wood will burn down to ash, but creosote, because it's distilled out of coal tar, it will it's already gone through high temperatures, so it will burn and burn and burn and burn, and eventually it will fuse out and leave a remnant in the water. So those creosote piles out there have been tempered by a major high heat fire as well.
The best practice for removing pilings is to vibrate them out, but if they have to be pulled or cut, research shows that the fracturing and breaking of the wood will harm local herring reproduction, English sole survival, and salmon immune systems for quite a while, well after the removal. Like everything involving Puget Sound recovery, the effort to remove creosote requires a mix of funding sources and stakeholder partners. The ferry system has been removing creosote since the 90s, getting about 12,000 tons out of the water since it started tracking the work in 2006. Again, though, funding is a problem. But even with the budget challenges, the system's sustainability program requires creosote removal be part of every project, including the new terminal at Mukilteo that included the removal of 3,000 pilings from an old Air Force fuel dock and the replacement of the 1930s-era Coleman dock in downtown Seattle.
So it's incorporated into the terminal projects we do. So as those terminal projects may get delayed, we don't see a lot of them getting completely wiped off the books just because this is essential. The terminal behind me, for instance, has trestle issues. They all do. It's something that ages over time. So we need to upkeep these if you want to have a ferry land at them. So it's something that is going to happen at these terminals. It may be delayed, but as we do the work that needs to happen to keep these terminals running, we will continue to do the work that we're doing with creosote just because we don't put in new creosote. So we always will be taking it out and replacing it with more environmentally friendly things like steel, a lot of times steel pile.
The trestle at the Point Defiance terminal and the replacement of a failing bulkhead at Tahlequah are on the list for upgrades in the next decade. The alarming decline in the orca population is what focused the ferry system's sustainability action plan on three things: the removal of creosote, building electric ferries, and reducing noise, all in the recognition of the interconnectedness of the food web and the threats it faces.
Our residents, king salmon in the Puget Sound, are some of the most polluted fish. I mean, everyone knows that who is a fisherman about how much of that fish you're supposed to eat every month. So it's very clear that we have issues with those toxics in the water, and it's all interrelated. It's interrelated habitat, interrelated toxics, interrelated prey availability, and then for us as well, and a big one we're hitting at the ferry system is noise. So we're actually addressing the underwater noise of our vessels and of our pile driving at the same time, and the impacts that that possibly has on orcas right now, on the southern residents, but also on other marine mammals, as well as, you know, it's going to eventually move into how those affect bait fish, how those affect salmon, how those affect the entire ecosystem. This is the Jojobas piling removal project. We acquired this 160-acre preserve last year, and now it's our job to clean it up and make it into just a nice nature preserve that will steward in perpetuity. And removing these piles behind me is part of that. These piles have creosote in them, and that's contains a bunch of toxic chemicals that leach out into the marine environment, and it negatively affects forage fish spawning, and that's what salmon eat, and salmon are what orcas eat. So fixing this up and making it a nice nature preserve without toxic chemicals is what we're doing here. This is part of a much wider effort. There's other organizations that are doing similar work all over the Puget Sound. Kitsap County, just up the canal in Port Gamble, they were partnering with Pope Resources to pull thousands of pilings, and all up and down the canal in the Puget Sound, we're removing all these creosoted pilings and taking a whole lot of toxic material out of the sound. Our new nature preserve here, it's the majority of a mile of undeveloped shoreline that will never be touched, and it's a really prime place for eelgrass to go, for salmon to hide in and eat from, and it's a good forage fish spawning beach, and removing the creosote from this area will hopefully help it be useful for those forage fish that salmon feed on, that orcas feed on, that help everything. Living in an area that has a good ecosystem really positively impacts people's quality of life. It's great to live in an area that have orcas coming by every now and again. It's great to be able to go fishing and harvest shellfish. That's a wonderful thing. So regular people can positively impact that in a lot of ways. You can become a member of a land trust. You can just get out into nature and enjoy nature responsibly. You can take the bus once a week. There's 100 different things that people can do, and fixing up a place like this is just one good example.
Unfortunately, removing creosote also means removing history, like the last remnants of the utopian colony at home, or the footprint of the many mills and factories that lined the Sound and built America.
Absolutely, that is a question. It's an ethical question we have to ask. I mean, if we completely erase any remnant or any evidence of anything associated with the use of that technology, what do we have to look to reference ourselves about things we wish we hadn't done? You know, there are buildings over water in, our waterfront towns all over where the cost of removing the creosote and the cost of engineering and replacing them with steel pile is, far exceeds the market value of the building itself. I think we need to figure out a way to balance the value and figure out a way to absorb the expense and the effort, the resources needed to be able to save the buildings and resolve the environmental effect of creosote.
A good example of that balance is Tacoma's Balfour Dock building. It houses the Foss Waterway Seaport Museum, where the creosote pilings were pulled and replaced with steel.
There's a way to get the environmental effects of creosote out of the water and still preserve the sense of place, the authenticity of the structure, and the memory of the human activity that occurred there.
In hindsight, so much of what happened to Puget Sound seems irresponsible. But you have to remember, we have insights previous generations did not, and the prosperity required to make the environment a priority.
Are we too hard in our judgment about them? Historically, that's just one of the pitfalls of gazing back into history. There's wisdom there that you want to be able to get, but there's also some sense of, judgment made that from an environmental standpoint, you have to wonder, what did no one think about this potentially having bad ramifications? But I guess in a way it's a cultural advancement. But it comes with a long-term cost where the bill doesn't come due until generations into the future. That's probably a mistake humans are still making and will continue to make.
But with that said, we do know the effects of letting untreated stormwater flow into the Sound, and the impact a toxic soup of nutrients and pharmaceuticals is having on aquatic life. Technology and a new spirit of resolve could, of course, step in to save the Sound, but this program does not end with good news.
You know, we really have serious problems with the environment. A lot of people don't think that because they look at the Sound, for example, and they say, oh, it's so beautiful, everything's wonderful, we're boating, we're fishing, and all this. But there's a very different reality there, and that is that we have all kinds of contaminants in our water, everything from fecal coliform to all different types of pollutants from automobiles. We have the creosote issue and others, and we can't just let this go on. And the real problem is that a lot of these things are driven by our population size. And the more and more people that move into the area, they are contaminators. All right, so every time we drive an automobile, for example, we're releasing pollutants into the environment. So we bring in another 1 million people, you have that many more automobiles, air pollution, other types of pollutants, overflows of sewage systems, things like that. So it's becoming worse and worse. It's not getting better.
The bottom line, everybody has to pitch in. Visit mycoast.org/WA and download the app to report the creosote you find. It's modern crowdsourcing to save the work nature did over millions of years. As always, I hope this program got you thinking and talking. I'm Tom Layson. Thanks for watching Northwest Now.